are because of the immense hard work that these young men have put in collecting the data. Now, as you all know, currently we are living through the sixth ever mass extinction in the roughly 4 billion year history of life on Earth. So there have been five mass extinctions in the past, including the one that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. And this is the sixth mass extinction ever in the Earth's history. And the important thing about this particular mass extinction is that it's entirely because of human activity, not because of natural changes in weather and climate and an asteroid hitting the Earth, none of those things. It's entirely because of human beings and the impacts they're having on the environment. And as you all probably know already, two of the most important impacts that humans are having on biodiversity on the planet are through two major things. One is climate change, which operates at massive global scales. The entire Earth is subject to changes to climate. We're really living through a climate crisis at the moment. The other is the loss and the degradation of natural habitats because, for example, forests are degraded, forests are lost because they're converted to agriculture and so on. So I won't go into the details of these how climate change and habitat loss have come about, but what I'll talk about a little more in detail is how these are affecting biodiversity in the Himalayas. Just to give you a sort of idea of the themes I'll be talking about and the kind of research that we'll be doing about these things, I'll first be talking about climate change and how ecological communities have the wherewithal and the capability to respond to climate change. Are they able to adapt to climate change, or because of climate change, are they basically doomed? The second thing I'll be talking about is the impacts that habitat loss and degradation have on species. So with climate change and ecological communities, I'll be talking about how species differ in their sensitivity to temperature and what that means for the elevational ranges that they have on mountains. With habitat loss and degradation, I'll be talking about selective logging, and I'll give you more details when I get to that, and how that affects the survival rates of Himalayan birds. And finally, we'll take these two things together, climate change and habitat loss. And when these two things operate together, what is the cumulative impact of both climate change and habitat loss on Himalayan birds? And of these, I'll be talking about two things. One is, what are the thermal niches of birds in the Himalayas? So basically, every bird species lives, feeds, reproduces in a certain temperature band. So some birds like cold temperatures, some birds like warm temperatures. What does it mean when different species like different temperatures in terms of the impact that climate change has on them? And I'll be talking about how species can or cannot survive over long terms in a warmer and more degraded Himalayas, because climate change and habitat loss are not operating separately. All these animals and birds and plants and so on in the Himalayas are facing both these threats together. So when they combine, what happens to them? So let me begin with climate change and ecological communities, specifically how different species are sensitive to different temperatures and what that means for biodiversity. Now, if you look at the map of the distribution of a species, and these are two species from Australia, the splendid fairy wren and the super fairy wren, you can see that both of them have certain ranges or geographic distributions. The splendid fairy wren is found in Western Australia and in Central Australia, and the super fairy wren is found on the eastern coast of Australia. Now, if you have a range, you also have range limits, right? Your range ends at a certain point. Now, what is it that determines where you are found and where you are not found? So basically, what is it that determines the limit to your range? Is it temperature, or is it competition between species? For example, the splendid fairy wren, does it just like warmer, drier habitats in the central part of Australia, or is the super fairy wren, which is found on the east coast, preventing the splendid fairy wren to expand its distribution to the east, and that's why it's not found over here, but it's limited to this part of Australia. So is it is it because the splendid Radiant likes a certain kind of temperature that it's found where it's found, or is it competition with the super fairy? And both these are very similar species, as you can see. So are they competing to restrict each other in certain parts of this continent? This is a very old problem. It's been debated since Darwin published on the origin of species in 1859. So people have been trying to answer whether it's temperature or whether it's competition for over 150 years. Now, Charles Darwin basically said, here's how it works. In the tropics, you have a lot of species. Whereas as you go towards the poles at higher latitudes, so basically as you go towards the poles, the latitude value of the latitude increases, right? You go from 0 to 10 to 20 and so on until when you hit the poles, you're at 90 degrees north or 90 degrees south, where the number of species is much lower. So what Darwin is saying is, in the tropics, because you have a much higher number of species, there should be more competition between species. And the ranges of species should be limited by competition. The other reason why competition should become important in the tropics is because the tropics are relatively aseasonal, which means that the temperatures that you find in summer and winter are not very different from each other. So species don't have any abiotic or environmental temperature stress acting on them. They're living in a very aseasonal environment. They don't have to adapt to very high or very low temperatures, but they're facing a lot of competition. So the geographical ranges of species in the tropics should be limited by competition between species, whereas as you go towards the poles at higher latitudes, the number of species is lower, but the temperature varies wildly across seasons. So if you go to the Arctic, you can have winters at minus 40 degrees Celsius, and in summer, you can have temperatures that go up to 35 degrees Celsius. So any species living near the poles has to be able to deal with massive fluctuations in temperature, but they don't compete with too many other species. So as you go towards the poles, it's not competition that's important anymore. It's the constraints imposed by temperature that determines where a species is found and where it's not found. So this is Darwin saying this 150 years ago. In 1967, this scientist called Daniel Jansen, who has written a lot of very, very important papers regarding a whole variety of things in ecology, he said, look, Darwin might be wrong. And the reason he says is that in the tropics, species are already used to living in a very narrow temperature range. So these species are adapted already to living in a very, very narrow, very nice, small temperature range. And that's why, because they're adapted to that small temperature range, any changes in temperature are going to stress them out because they're not adapted to very high or very low temperatures. And that's the reason why, because they lack the adaptability to very high or very low temperatures, these species are limited not by competition, but more likely to be limited by their temperature sensitivity. So here you have two very, very influential biologists saying opposite things, right? So in Darwin is saying in the tropics, competition affects species ranges, whereas Jansen comes along about 50, 60 years ago and says, no, in the tropics it's temperature that limits where a species is found and where it's not found. Now, why is this important? Why is it important to know whether temperature affects the range of a species or not, especially in the Himalayas? The reason for that is you know that the earth is heating up very, very fast. But the degree of warming in the Himalayas, or the speed of warming in the Himalayas, is thrice as fast as the global average. So if on average the earth is warming up by 1 degree Celsius for the entire globe, if that is the global average, the Himalayas will warm by 3 degrees Celsius, which is a huge, huge change in temperature that species in the Himalayas are facing. So it's important to understand what implications future climate has on the species in the Himalayas. Sort of, and that's also important to understand, because if you look at a map of species richness or the number of species that are found in any part of the globe, and this map is for birds, but it's also true for mammals and plants and arthropods and so on. And the map is color coded such that as the number of species becomes less, the color is lighter, and as the number of species is higher, the color is darker. So you can see at the bottom the legend that shows you the number of bird species. So you can see when there are 2 to 5 bird species breeding in a certain place, the color is very light on the map. Whereas if you've got a large number of species breeding in a certain place, the color is very, very dark. Now, if you look at this map, where is it that you find the maximum number of species? Now, barring very, very certain exceptions like the Amazon basin here in South America, the maximum number of species that you would find in the world are in tropical mountain ranges. So the Andes in South America, the Eastern Arc Mountains in Africa, and the Himalayan mountain range and the Western Ghats in India and in Asia. So most of the Earth's terrestrial biodiversity is concentrated in these tropical mountain ranges. And if these mountain ranges are warming up very, very fast, then climate change is likely to affect a very, very huge proportion of species that are found in the world. So it's important to understand how climate change is going to affect these species. Now, if you look at the Himalayas alone, there are very, very strong abiotic and biotic gradients along the length of the Himalayas. So the Himalayas are an east-west mountain range. So they go from the west to the east. In India, Nepal, Bhutan are the 3 countries that hold most of the Himalayas. Now, if you look at the color coding of these 2 maps, what you can see above is the annual variation in temperature. So these black circles are our study sites where we've been studying birds for a long time. In the west, you have the Great Himalayan National Park in Himachal Pradesh, and in the east, you have Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh. And just to give you an idea, the seasonality or the annual temperature variation within a year between summer and winter, that is twice as high in the west than it is in the east. So the east is about half as seasonal as the west. Temperature seasonality in the east is half as much as temperature seasonality in the west. So if you were to use the tropical temperate comparison, the eastern Himalayas are much more tropical than the western Himalayas. But if you look at bird species richness, and that's again color coded in terms of the number of birds that you find in these places, the east has twice the number of bird species that you would find in the west. So put together, what we're finding here is that the east is half as seasonal, it has half the amount of temperature variability that you would find in the west. The west has extremely cold winters and warm summers, whereas in the east, that difference between summer and winter is much, much lower. But the east has twice the number of bird species. So it's half as seasonal, but has twice the number of bird species. What does this mean in terms of this framework that Darwin put together? And that again, on top is a little bit of a schematic that shows you that the east in terms of temperature, which is this little diagram here, is half as seasonal. It's got warm summers, but winters are not as cold. Whereas in the east, you have much higher, you have high temperatures in summer and very low temperatures in the winter. And you have half the number of bird species in the west that you would find in the east. So Darwin would say that competition is very, very important in the east, and temperature should not be very important in the east in limiting species distributions. Whereas in the west, you should say competition is not very important because you have a lower number of species, but because
Excuse me, sir.
Go
I'm really
on.
sorry to interrupt. I think some participant has shared her
Yes,
screen.
Poonam Sharma is sharing. Ask her to
Yes, so
go
Dr.
to.
Ramesh, I think you need to share it again to get it
I
visible
need
to
to
the audience.
share my screen again.
Yes, you need to actually because some of the
Oh, I see.
participant has taken your screen. I'm really sorry for that.
I see. No problem. No problem. I'll do that now.
Participants plus please avoid these kind of situations.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir, it is visible. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Right. So, wait a minute. Let me put this on and can you see my entire screen or can you just see, all right. So you can see the slideshow, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
All right, fine. So Darwin would say that in the Western Himalayas, because you have a lower number of species but high temperature seasonality, it should be temperature that limits species ranges. Whereas in the Eastern Himalayas, because you have lower seasonality but high bird species richness, you should see competition influencing species ranges. Jansen would say not really. The eastern Himalayan bird species are highly adapted to a very, very small temperature range. So any change in temperature because of climate change should really stress these species out because they're simply not adapted to being able to deal with small variations in temperature. All right. So this is what we did to test these hypotheses by Darwin and by Jansen, which is we selected these two sites in the Himalayas, the Great Himalayan National Park and Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, which are in the west and the east, respectively, and they're separated by about 1,500 kilometers as a straight line distance. And what we did in each of these sites was to set up these transects across this entire elevational gradient. So we have transects in the, I'll give you the eastern Himalayas as an example. We have transects going from 1,000 meters above sea level all the way up to 3,000 meters above sea level. And these transects, which are these white lines over here that are spanning this entire elevational range of 2,000 meters, are basically paths or just demarcated lines through the forest where we walk on these transects and at the same time while we're walking we look for birds and we record which bird species we see. And while we're recording which bird species we see, every elevational transect that we're using, we also put out these temperature monitors. So if we have a transect going, for example, in this case, from about 2,000 meters all the way up to 3,000 meters, we have 5 temperature little buttons that monitor the temperature. So while we're walking the transect and looking for birds, these temperature monitors are also recording temperature at the same time. What that means is on, for example, the 20th of April, if I saw this bird, the fire-tailed Myzornis, at this location X at, let's say, 9 a.m., what I can do using the temperature monitors above the species and below the species, I can tell you using some simple mathematics, calculate what the temperature of that sighting was. So that bird was at, based on these two temperature monitors, at, let's say, 20 degrees Celsius. So for every bird that we see, we can also calculate what temperature it is at. And we do this in summer and in winter. Why do we do that? The reason being, a lot of the Himalayan bird species are what are called elevational migrants. So in summer, they go up to higher elevations and they breed at higher elevations. When winter comes, the higher elevations become too cold and they're unable to find insects and so on. What they do is that they come down to lower elevations. So they're at higher elevations in summer, they're at lower elevations in winter. So they can potentially spend the entire year at the same temperature, right? They can be in summer at 20 degrees Celsius at high elevations, When it gets too cold, they can come down lower to a place which is also 20 degrees Celsius in winter. So they can spend potentially the entire year at 20 degrees Celsius. So a species that is very, very tightly correlated with temperature, it has to be, let's say, between 22 degrees Celsius and 25 degrees Celsius. It has the ability to do this by moving up and down in the mountain between two seasons. Yeah. Now, what we're looking at in terms of ranges and range limits are actually the elevational range limits of species. So we're saying, what is the summer range limit of the species? Is it 1800 meters to 2400 meters? What is the winter range limit of species? Is it 1200 meters to 1600 meters? And what are the temperatures in summer and winter that these species face? Now, this is a bit of a complicated diagram, but I won't go into the whole thing. But if you just look at D and C over here, you have on the x-axis minimum temperature, on the y-axis maximum temperature. C is the temperature that the species is experiencing in summer, and D is the temperature that the species is experiencing in winter. So generally, this temperature, both minimum and maximum, are lower in winter than the temperatures that is experiencing in summer. So if the species was completely dependent on a certain temperature, C and D would overlap completely. Yeah. So the temperature in summer would be identical to the temperature in winter where the species is living. So what we did is calculate this overlap between the temperature that a species spends in summer and the temperature that a species spends in winter, and look at the value of this overlap for birds in the eastern Himalayas and birds in the western Himalayas. Yeah. So don't get into the details of the calculation, but generally the higher the overlap, the more temperature constrained a species is, the more likely it is to want to live in a particular temperature band throughout the year. What we see is very interesting. In general, in the eastern Himalayas, the temperature overlap between summer and winter is much higher than the western Himalayas for the bird community as a whole. But not only the bird community as a whole, now these are 10 species on the right over here that are found both in the western Himalayas as well as the eastern Himalayas. Even the populations of the same species, I'll give you the example of the yellow-bellied fantail, which is this species here, has much higher temperature overlap between summer and winter in the east than the temperature overlap it has in the west. And that's true for most of these species, where temperature overlaps in the east between summer and winter are higher than temperature overlaps in the west for different populations of the same species in the eastern and western Himalayas. So it looks as if eastern Himalayan species and populations generally are much more thermally sensitive. They're much more sensitive to temperature than their western Himalayan counterparts, which gives you support for Daniel Jensen's hypothesis, which is that species that are found in aseasonal habitats, relatively aseasonal habitats, where summer and winter temperatures don't change very much, are also species that are very, very thermally sensitive. They will try as much as they can to live in the same thermal environment as far as possible. So when it comes to climate change and the potential impacts it might have on species in the Himalayas, it's likely that small changes or large changes in temperature because of climate change are likely to affect eastern Himalayan bird species much more than western Himalayan bird species, because the western Himalayan bird species seem to be able to already deal with the much higher temperature variability that's found in the western Himalayas. So that's about climate change and how that might affect species. Let's look at habitat loss and degradation in terms of what's called logging and how that affects the survival of Himalayan birds. Now, this is a project that is...
Sorry to disturb. I think your screen has been frozen. It is still in the temperature or competition slide. I just want to continue.
Sorry. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let me just disconnect and reconnect again.
Yes, sir, sure.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir, now it is visible. The screen was frozen for a while, sir.
And is it changing?
Yes, now it's changing, sir.
But
Oh, okay, right. So I'll start off with the screen here again.
full screen, sir.
Sorry?
We prefer slideshow, sir.
Slideshow.
All right. Here we go. Oops. What's wrong with this?
In base also there.
Right, all right. So what we did is in the Eastern Himalayas in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, look at what's called logging and how that affects the survival of Himalayan birds. Now, logging is a practice where this is called selective logging, which is where a subset of the forest trees are cut down and removed from the forest. Now, these are commercially important tree species, or they're commercially important because they're very, very large. Excuse me. So what you see on the left side of this image here is a selectively logged forest where some of the trees in the middle have been cut down and removed, whereas what you see on the right side is what is called primary forest, and the primary forest has never been disturbed. So you see a much more close canopy with no gaps in the primary forest, whereas if you look at the logged forest, you see a much more open canopy. Yeah, the canopy is not as closed as, you can clearly see that it's disturbed on the left side. So that's what selective logging is. Now the real question is, are populations of species in selectively logged forest viable or not? Which means if you only had selectively logged forest, would you find that all these forest species can survive over time without any problem? Now, most of the work that's been done on selective logging has looked at species richness, compared species richness between
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry, but it isn't moving. I think now it has come to 31 slide number. Before this, it was on 28. We couldn't see it.
31. Yes, it's on 31.
It was frozen for a while, so.
Wait a minute.
Yes, sir, sure.
Can you see species richness on top now?
Yes, sir. The scale of studies on land use change.
That's right. All right. I think maybe there's a bit of a bandwidth problem. So if people who have their videos on could turn them off, and I'll do the same with mine, it might not get frozen as much as before.
Yes, sir. I request all of you to please turn your video also off, so it will be better for us to follow the lecture.
Thank you, Heini.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So you got, most people compare species richness between primary forest and log forest. So they'll say, species richness in primary forest is 30 species, whereas the number of species in log forest is 20 species. So primary forest can support a much larger number of species than log forest can support. But what we were really interested in is to look at what is it that drives species richness. So ultimately that is what's called survival rates. So what is the probability that an individual of a particular species can survive from 1 year to the next? Now that probability is between 0 and 1. Either 0 individuals survive from 1 year to the next, or all the individuals survive from 1 year to the next. Now 0 and 1 is the same as saying 0% of species survive from 1 year to the next, or 100% of species survive from 1 year to the next. So we want to estimate that. We did this work in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, which is in Arunachal Pradesh. That's the white thing is the outline of Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. And within Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, we studied populations of birds in what's called cloud forest at 2,000 meters above sea level, where we have primary forest, which is on the left, and log forest, which is on the right. Now, log forest, you can see, has a much more open canopy. There's a lot of sunlight coming down to the understory, and bamboo has really taken off down in the lower levels of the forest. Whereas on the left, if you look at primary forest, it's got almost 2.5 times the number of trees. It's got 200 trees per hectare in primary forest, whereas only 75 trees per hectare in log forest. And you can see that the canopy is much.
Sorry, sir, but the screen is frozen again. Every time that we're trying to tell you, the screen
Oops.
shifts at that time, but until then it's frozen.
All right. What can we do about this?
Maybe if when you change the next slide, you can just maybe ask us once, and then we'll just confirm that if it's changed.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Sure, I'll do that.
Next or something, and if it is not changing, we'll let you know.
Sure, I'll do that.
Yes,
Can
sorry,
you
sir.
see?
Thank you.
No, not at all. No problem. No problem. Can you see your primary and log on top? 200 trees per hectare and 75 trees per
Yes, sir.
hectare?
Slide 36, yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
That's right. That's right. So here we go again. So primary forest generally has a whole lot more trees than log forest. I'm changing the slide. And what we did, this is a map of our study area. We put in 3 permanent plots
So
in each of.
37 is not visible.
It's
Sorry,
not
still-
visible.
yeah, it's
What
still
about
visible.
now?
Okay, now we can see it. Long-term bird population.
Okay, so then what I'll do is I'll try to keep the slide like this and not go into the presentation view. Let's see if that helps.
Okay, sir.
All right, so we have 3 plots in log forest which are outlined in red and 3 plots in primary forest which are outlined in green. And what we're doing is we are sampling the bird population in each of these plots. And we've been doing this since 2011 onwards. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it this year because of the pandemic. And each of those white dots in these plots are the location of a mist net. I'll tell you what that is. I'm changing the slide here. A
It's
mist
visible.
net. All right, great. A mist net is what you see on the left side. It's a vertical net that you put up in the forest and it's invisible to birds. So we put up these mist nets. Now each of those white dots in this slide is a mist net. We put up those many mist nets in the forest, and birds basically can't see the mist net. They fly into these mist nets and get caught. Yeah, these mist nets are so invisible that even though I know where these mist nets are in the forest, I have often walked into these mist nets and got caught. So they really, you really cannot see them in the forest. So once the bird is caught, what we do is we take the bird out, we weigh it, we measure it, and we put this numbered aluminum ring on the leg of the bird. Now this is a bird that you can see with a ring on it. And we put the ring, and this takes about 2 minutes. We put the ring on the bird and we release it immediately. And so it's out there in the forest doing whatever birds do. This is a photograph that one of the tourists to Eagle Nest has taken, and you can see the bird in the wild with the ring on it. Then we go back the next year and we put these mist nets in the same place. And because they're in the same place and the birds have territories, the next year either we catch new birds which have not been caught before, so they don't have any rings, or we catch the same birds that we have ringed in the past, which are what are called recaptures. What we do with this information is this, I've changed the slide now, is that we generate what's called a capture history. So I'll give you an example of one of these birds. Let's say the ring number is Z57909. This bird was caught in the first year, which is the 1 there, caught in the second year, and caught in the third year. So this is a 3-year example, although we've been doing it for 9 years. Bird number Z57921, the second bird here, was not caught in the first year. It was caught in the second year, but not caught in the third year. And based on this information and 2 probabilities, what is the probability that a bird survives from 1 year to the next? So it's there on the territory and it can be caught. 2, what is the probability that it is caught? And don't worry about the formula, but you put those 2 probabilities together, the probability of catching the bird and the probability of the bird surviving, and you can estimate at the population level what is the probability of survival. Now, over the years, we've had a lot of captures of a lot of species. It's 130 species, which you can imagine is a huge number because we're not catching anything that's up in the canopy because they're too high to be able to be caught. So you can really see that the Eastern Himalayas is a really, really species-rich area of the world. Now, we compared the survival rates of 20 species, and what we did first was to look at species that join mixed species flocks versus species that feed alone. So some of these bird species which have tick marks against them, they join mixed species flocks, which means that multiple species will come together and feed together. Now, it's thought, and there's good evidence for it, that all these species coming together and feeding together provides the members of this mixed flock with two advantages. One is they get better access to food, and two is they get protection from predators. So some of these species like the Sultan tit, which is in the center of this flock, for example, is very good at looking out for predators and giving alarm calls. Whereas the beautiful Natatch, which is this species, it's not very good at looking out for predators. So when it joins the Sultan tit, it's basically getting early warning against predators, which would increase its survival rate. On the other hand, the long-tailed broadbill here is not very good at finding food, maybe, because the kind of insects that it eats are sitting in the vegetation, and it's very difficult to search for those insects. But when it joins another species like the minivet, and the minivet basically forms huge flocks of the same species that join these mixed flocks, as they go through the forest, they disturb the vegetation, and the insects fly out, which make it easier for the long-tailed broadbill to feed, which should also increase survival, because the more food you have, the better condition you're in. So what we thought was that given that these birds join mixed species flocks, they should be able to deal with the food pressures and the predation pressures that you have in log forest as well. So the survival rate should not change too much between primary forest and log forest. Whereas species that forage alone, they don't have the opportunity to get predation benefits and benefits of feeding. They should really show survival declines in log forest. And that's sort of what we find. So the green bars that you see are primary forest, the brown bars are log forest. On the x-axis is whether a species joins mixed flocks or whether it forages solitarily. On the y-axis is the survival rate from year to year for each species, for these species. We've put together all the species that join flocks in one bar, all the species that forage solitarily in another bar. So you can see these are the standard errors around that estimate. For example, the flocking species in primary forest have a survival rate of about 56%. And in log forest, they have a survival rate of about 51%. But these standard errors are overlapping with each other, right? So the survival rate is not all that different between primary forest and log forest. So the survival rates of flocking species are similar to the, in log forest are similar to the survival rates of flocking species in primary forest. Whereas if you look at solitary foraging species, they have about 50% survival in primary forest, but they have about 35% survival in log forest, which is a huge reduction in survival rates. And these error bars don't overlap, which means we can say with some confidence that the survival rates of solitary foraging species do come down drastically with logging. So logging doesn't seem to affect too much the survival rates of flocking species, but it does affect the survival rates of solitary foraging species, which do not have the option to join other species. Just genetically, they're not hardwired to be able to join other species to get these benefits from predation and resources. We're running a little short of time, so I won't go into this in detail, but basically, if you look at migratory species, elevational migrants and resident species, which are species that live in the same place, the same elevations in summer and winter, generally resident species have a slightly lower survival rates in log forest, whereas migratory species don't show very clear changes in survival. So selective logging is a form of forest degradation that basically affects solitary foraging species that are also resident or don't migrate. So it really affects a certain class of species in terms of their survival rates. So that's about selective logging, how that affects bird survivals. Let's put these two things together, which is climate change as well as habitat loss and degradation. Now again, running a little short on time, so I won't go into details of the thermal leashes and the tolerance to agriculture, which is a separate project that we did. But what I'll do is jump straight to surviving in a warmer, more degraded Himalayas, because the Himalayas are not only, I'm just skipping over if we have enough time, I'll go back to this in the end. But I'm going to jump to this, which is surviving in a warmer and more degraded Himalayas. Now the Himalayas are not only warming up, they're also losing forest. So they're warming at thrice the global average, 3 times as fast as the global average, but they're also getting more and more degraded. Forests are being lost, they're being selectively logged, and they're being converted to agriculture and so on. And both these things are affecting biodiversity together. So we really want to know what happens when climate change and habitat degradation operate together. Now again, I'm going to talk about selective logging, which is the form of forest degradation, as well as climate change acting together in the Himalayas. And we're back to those permanent sampling plots that we had, 3 in primary forest, 3 in log forest, again using mist netting to estimate survival rates at 2000 meters above sea level on this mountainside. This is a very simple schematic of a mountain, and we are sampling on these plots which are at 2000 meters above sea level. Now again, we use the same technique, which is mist netting and the same formula to estimate survival. But now we're going to estimate survival rates and how they change over time. So have there been changes in survival rates over time in primary forest and over time in log forest because of climate change? So as the temperature slowly warms up every year, we should be seeing changes in survival rates. And how do we expect survival rates to change? Now at 2000 meters, we have certain species like this blue one here that has an elevational range that is largely below 2000 meters. It's much colder higher up in the mountain, warmer lower down in the mountain. This blue band are the temperatures, it's the elevation where this species is found. So this particular blue species, for it, 2000 meters is at the cold edge of its elevational range. There are certain other species which are at the warm edges of their elevational range. So this species likes the temperatures that are found in this part of the mountain. And for this species, this is the warmer part of its range, this is the colder part of its range, and 2000 meters, which is where we sample, there's nothing particularly special about 2000 meters, it's just where we have our study plots. This species is at the warmer part of its elevational range. Now, as temperatures increase, what the temperature that you find at this elevation, 10 years from now, you would find it at a higher elevation because temperatures are basically increasing as you go up the mountain. So this yellow species, as it leaves this elevation and moves higher up, it should show decreases in survival as it's moving up because the temperature is becoming worse and worse for it with climate change. Whereas this blue species, as it moves higher up, 2000 meters should become better and better for it in terms of temperature because of climate change, and it should show survival increases, right? Excuse me. So we looked at a bunch of species. There are 15 species, which are all these species over here. These are species like ground warblers, other warbler species, laughing thrushes, flycatchers, chats, and a whole range of babbler species in eagle nest. And what we find in terms of survival over time, now the x-axis is year or time. So the survival rates, how the species was surviving at what probability between 2011 and 2012 to what was the probability of surviving between 2017 and 2018. And what we find is that in primary forests, which are these green bars, we find there are some species that show declining survival. So the survival rates were very high between 2011 and 2012, about 90%. And as it's warming up over time, the survival rate of the species has gone down to about 20%. So there are a large number of species that show declines in survival. Some species don't really show changes, whereas other species are showing increased survival rates over time, but this is only in primary forests. So what we're seeing, now remember we are sampling at 2000 meters, which is represented by this vertical bar. So the species that you find to the left of this vertical bar have most of their elevational ranges below 2000 meters. So the x-axis is the midpoint of the elevational range of a species. So if the midpoint is 1600 meters, the elevational range could be between 1400 meters and 1800 meters. Right in the middle is the midpoint of the elevational range, which is 1600 meters. So most of the elevational range of the species is below 2000 meters, whereas to the right, you have a space where most of the elevational range of a species is above 2000 meters. So species to the left should be moving up into 2000 meters. Species on the right should be moving away from 2000 meters, even higher up. And what you see on the y-axis is the slope of survival over time. Yeah, so that is over time, is the survival increasing or decreasing? So above zero, survival rates are increasing over time. That's a positive value. Below zero, survival rates are decreasing over time. That is, survival is reducing over time. That's below zero. What we should see is this, that for species that are mostly below 2000 meters, survival rate should increase over time at 2000 meters over here, because these species are moving up into a temperature that's more suitable for them. Whereas the species that are mostly above 2000 meters should show survival decreases over time, and they should be here. They're mostly above 2000 meters and their survival rates over time should become negative. And that's what we find in primary forest. Species that are mostly above 2000 meters show negative survival rates. Species which are mostly below 2000 meters show positive survival rates. So this is what we expected. This is what we're finding in primary forest. What happens in log forest, which are these brown lines now? We did not expect this at all. But if you look at the brown lines, survival rates for most of these species are not changing over time. So this species, for example, the black-throated parrotbill, had about 40% survival in 2011 and 12. It still got about 40% survival between 2017 and 18 and the time periods between. So even though in primary forest survival rates are really declining for this species, in log forest, the survival rates are not really changing. And that's what you see in this overall graph over here, which is survival rates of species, of the same species in log forest are roughly zero. Sorry, not survival rates. Change in survival is roughly zero, which means there has been really no change in survival, regardless of whether the species is a low elevation species or a high elevation species. What does this mean? One of the things that this means is that we might already have lost species in log forest because of climate change. If you look at these three species that are outlined in black, we had enough data to be able to estimate the survival rates of these species in primary forest over time. But there are so few individuals of these species in log forest that we're just not able to estimate survival rates in log forest. So we might already have lost most of the individuals of these species in log forest than in primary forest, which is basically could be reducing the number of species that can survive in log forest, which means that there's a kind of biotic homogenization happening. What else does this mean? Similarly, it could mean that these species that simply cannot make it in log forest, there's something happening here which is causing these species to be unable to survive in log forest, but able to survive in primary forest, even in the face of climate change. So even though there's climate change happening, these species might be able to adapt by moving higher up, but they're not able to do it in log forest. So if you look at this species here, which is the white-tailed robin, the panel N, survival rates are rising very sharply in primary forest, which means that this species, by moving upwards, is able to survive in log forest, but the survival rates in primary forest, but the survival rates in log forest are not rising as much. So if that species is in primary forest, it's able to adapt to climate change, but in log forest, not as well. And this is the same thing you find with other species like this, which is survival rates are changing greatly from 20% roughly in 2011 and 12 to about 80% in 2017 and 18, but not much change in survival in log forest. So these species in the populations in primary forest can adapt, but the populations in log forest seem to be unable to adapt. Now, the one other thing that's important here, I think, is to be able to factor in climate change into land use studies. So if you're studying logging and you're saying how does logging affect survival rates, and you compare the survival rates in primary forest and in log forest, and you look at this species in 2011, 2012 and 13, and you estimate the survival rates here, they look very similar. And you might conclude that survival rates are similar in primary forest and in log forest, so logging is not so bad for species. But if you look at the survival rates over time, over here, primary forest survival rates are much higher than log forest survival rates. But if you ignore the effect of time basically being how temperatures are changing over time, then you might get very, very wrong inferences about how land use change like selective logging is affecting species. So what this means, it looks like that as climate change occurs and species need to move higher and higher up, you need this kind of mountain on the right, where there's primary forest from lower down all the way higher up to allow species to move higher and higher and maintain their survival rates. But if you have a mountain like this on the left, species will move higher up, and then if they get to agricultural land or log forest, they're just unable to maintain their survival rates, and they might go extinct on this mountain simply because they reach a kind of land use that is human modified and not very good for them. So over the years, what we've done is we work with a tribal community called the Bugun tribe in the same area of Arunachal Pradesh. And this is also a place where this bird species called the Bugun leochikla has been found. It's a very, very rare species. It's found in a very small area in the Bugun community owned and community managed forest land, which is about a 2 square kilometer area. And the globally known population of this species is about 20 individuals. So there are more people, there are about thrice as many people on this Google Meet than there are Bugun leochiklas in the wild. So it becomes very important to try and protect this species and its habitat. And over the years, what we've done working with the Bugun community is to set up this community reserve for this species and a whole lot of other endangered species, which spans about 1500 meters at the lower elevation, all the way up to 3300 meters, which is the highest point in this landscape, which will allow species to be able to move up in response to climate change and survive over time. So basically, it looks like primary forest is essential for species to be able to adapt to climate change, whereas any alternative land use like agriculture or selective logging might cause species to lose out. So climate change and human use of a habitat seems to be working together to make habitats very, very detrimental for species. So the combined effect of these two things is quite so this is sort of a summary of what we talked about. Again, it's just about past 12 o'clock, but and again we're a little out of short of time. But this is the kind of research that we're probably going to do in the future, looking at thermal stresses and so on. And so this is the kind of work that we'll be doing on climate change, forest degradation, and what that means for Himalayan biodiversity in the future. I've put in my email addresses at the bottom here. So if anybody would like to discuss these things further, you're welcome to write to me. And I hope to have very interesting discussions in the future with all of you. So I'll end here. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about the research that we're doing. And I hope you have a great wildlife week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. It was a really informative session. So the participants have a few questions. So can I start?
Sure.
Okay. So participants, you're requested to post your questions in the chat box. In case you want to unmute and talk, just let us know that. So the first question is by Nature Wanderer. He asks, Dear sir, what is the mist net made up of? How long you keep the mist net in forests? Is that cause any vulnerable to birds? As you said, birds are not able to see the nets. What is the frequency of checking birds which got captured using mist nets? So this
Right. Yes, this is a great question. It's very, very important. The frequency of checking nets is extremely important. So what we do is we put out the nets at about dawn. And let's say by the time we finish opening all the nets, about 4:30 in the morning. Remember, Arunachal is far to the east, so sunrise is very, very early. Sunset is also very early. And we keep the nets open till about 11:30. We check the nets every 20 minutes. And then we close the nets at 11:30. So checking the nets very frequently is essential because you don't want the bird to get stuck in a net and stay there for a very long time because it's a relatively cold area in the Himalayas. So you don't want the bird being inactive and being susceptible to the cold. The other thing is that the longer a bird is in the net, it can get stuck quite badly. You don't want that happening as well. So we check the nets every 20 minutes. If there's rain, we close the nets. If it gets too cold, we close the nets. So really the well-being of the bird is the primary concern when we have our nets open.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is how effective the bird ringing is. How effective is the bird ringing is helpful for the study of biodiversity laws?
Biodiversity laws?
That's all. The question is how effective the bird ringing is helpful for the study of biodiversity laws. The study
biodiversity laws. Oh, sorry. I heard biodiversity laws. I was wondering what's that. No, all right. So it depends on the question you're asking. Now, the reason why we end up ringing birds is because we cannot identify individual birds in the field, right? So if you go out into the field and you see a crow, you can't tell which crow it is. Did you see that the same crow yesterday or was it a different crow yesterday? So we can't tell individual birds apart just by looking at them. So when it comes to studies of things like survival rates, and if you're interested in birds, you really have to ring them. Whereas if you're interested in looking at survival in tigers, you don't have to catch them and put any kind of mark on the tiger because the stripes are enough to be able to tell one tiger from another tiger. So the only reason why we're doing bird ringing is to be able to, when we catch the bird the next time, is it the same bird that we caught the last time, or is it a different species of bird? If we did not have that, if we could tell different birds apart by their markings, we would not be doing bird ringing at all. So one is why we do bird ringing, it's to estimate survival rates. But there are other questions for biodiversity loss that might not require bird ringing. For example, if you just wanted to see in a small forest fragment how many species are there versus a large forest fragment, you wouldn't need to ring individuals. You could just go out there, count the number of species in the forest fragment just by looking at the bird species there and compare the number of species between large fragments and small fragments. So in that case, you don't really need to ring birds for understanding biodiversity loss. It's really what part of biodiversity loss you want to understand that determines whether you ring birds or not.
Okay, sir. We'll move on to the next question. Sharvanan has a question asking you, have you in any way observed any predation of birds held in the mist net?
Predation of birds in the mist net?
Yes, sir.
Now that we are very lucky. We have not had a single instance of predation for a bird trapped in the mist net. I know that in other parts of the world, people are very, very concerned about that because, if you put out a mist net and birds get stuck, then things like hawks, things like mongooses often come and hang around these mist nets waiting for birds to get trapped. But at 2,000 meters in the Himalayas, we're very lucky that the predators, largely the predators of birds that you find at other elevations, we've not had any problem with them. We've not lost a single bird to predation in the mist net.
Thank you, sir. So Ajit has a question. How do you convince community to conserve a species which they have no direct dependency on, purely on aesthetic or ecological importance?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are multiple aspects of this. One of them is, and this is not possible in all cases, one of them is to try and find some kind of economic benefit from the species itself to the community. That is something we have managed to do through international bird tourism. Because this species is so rare, the Bugun leochicla, you can't see it anywhere else. Apart from that, the eastern Himalayas are so species rich, there are so many species that people want to come and see, which are also rare but not as rare as the species. So you have things like the ward strogon, you have the beautiful nuthatch, the Blight's tragopan, and a whole range of other species. Now, people who want to see these other rare species can go to other parts of Arunachal Pradesh and see them. But the one species they cannot see anywhere else is the Bugun leochicla. So what we have is a whole lot of international tourists who pay a lot of money, which is partly goes to the community. But they have a very low ecological impact. So they're really high income, but low impact tourists who come looking for these bird species. So that has really led to a transformation of the economy of this area. And like I said, this is not possible in all cases, right? You might discover a critically endangered arthropod, but given that there's not as much interest in arthropods as there is in birds, very few people might actually come to look for the arthropod in that area. The other thing that has happened in this particular case is that the person who discovered the species had the right to name it whatever he wanted. So it could have been named, a black-capped leochicla, for example. But he chose to name it after the Bugun tribe. Bugun is B-U-G-U-N, the Bugun tribe of Arunachal Pradesh, because it was found on the lands that the Bugun community owns and manages till today. So it became a source of pride for the Bugun community. Such a rare bird species, critically endangered, it's found only on our land. It's also named after us. So it's a matter of pride for us to have this species on our land, and we should do something to conserve it. The other economic advantage that has come about after the declaration of this community reserve is that people from the village are getting employment as forest guards. So this is a village of about 60 households, out of which 10 households, people from 10 households have been hired as forest guards permanently. So the community reserve has been declared by the state government, and the staff of the community reserve, who are all Bugun people, all from the local village, are getting a salary in perpetuity. So there's some economic advantage from that side as well.
Hello, sir. I think Harini is not able to connect. I will read out the questions for you. So next question is from Amrita Jaiprakash. Sir, you mentioned about temperature on birds. So, sir, what about temperature creating adaptive changes within the morphology or foraging habits of birds?
Again, lovely question. So, temperature, let's break this down into two parts. Let's look at morphology as well as foraging habits. Now, morphology is something that has been selected over time from natural selection, and it's in response to a whole lot of selective pressures that a species has a certain morphology. Now, climate, temperature can definitely change the morphology of a species. So you have variability in the population, and because of changes in climate, for example, let's say smaller birds are at a selective advantage, then over time that species should become smaller and smaller as the effect of climate mediated natural selection acts on that population. Now, if the change in the climate is very, very slow, then it gives time to the population to adapt to that change in climate, because it needs a certain time to be able to adapt to changes in climate. But the rate at which the climate is changing right now, it is so fast and so quick that it's more likely that rather than changes in morphology to be able to adapt to climate, the rate at which it's changing prevents that from happening. It's more likely to cause extinction of species rather than any adaptation. Now, when it comes to behavior, that's very interesting, because behavior is something that can change immediately, unlike morphology. Morphology will take time, whereas behavior, you can say it's very, very hot right now, so I'm not going out to forage because I'm just going to overheat, I'm going to get a heat stroke. So a lot of birds are probably choosing, when it's very hot, to not go out and forage but stay in the shade. Now, if you look at logged forests, that's about 2 degrees Celsius hotter than primary forest. And if you look at something that is really clears up the forest, like agricultural lands are about 8 degrees Celsius warmer than primary forest. Now, 8 degrees Celsius is a huge increase in temperature. So you can imagine that birds are really changing their behaviors in agricultural lands and logging and log forest, because it's getting too hot to be able to go out and feed. And that's one of the things that we think is happening, that the survival rates of birds in log forest is becoming lower and lower because these birds have to spend much less time feeding, which directly impacts their survival. So definitely temperature is likely to have a huge impact on feeding rates.
Okay, sir. I thank you so much. I think that was the last question that we had. Thank you so much, sir, for being here and giving this wonderful talk for us and answering all the questions. I'm sure the participants, if they have any more questions, sir has already given his email ID. Please, I hope, sir, it's okay that they contact you. And thank you so much again for the wonderful talk. It was great. I would like to thank all our faculty members, especially Dr. N. Patsati, who was our faculty coordinator for this webinar, Dr. Sundar Pandyan sir, our HOD Jaikumar sir and Ramurthy sir, and every other participant who joined us today and made this webinar a great one. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, sir, again for joining. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.